Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Dead Reckoning podcast. This has got to be one of my favorite. It's about Frank Abagnale Jr. I'm a huge fan of the movie Catch Me If You Can, and this is going to be all about how his story is probably exaggerated and all that stuff. And it's going to ruin my enjoyment of a Leonardo DiCaprio and Tom Hanks masterpiece. I enjoyed the hell out of that movie. It's one of my favorite movies, and I think I should watch it again. That made me feel a bit sad, because unfortunately at the end of this, I'm going to pretty much ruin it for myself and possibly everyone else, but it's still a good movie. Do you think I'll still want to watch it by the time we get into the end of this episode? Because right now I'm like, I should watch it again. It's good. By the end, I'll be like, that movie was filled with lies and I have no respect for anyone in that movie anymore, including Tom Hanks. Everybody loves Tom Hanks. In case you haven't seen it, Catch Me If You Can is a film from 2002. So it's about 23 years old. It's nearly a quarter of a century. Holy hell. It was directed by Steven Spielberg and stars Leonardo DiCaprio as real-life con-man extraordinary Frank Abagnale Jr. Tom Hanks plays somewhat against type as a grumpy FBI agent Carl Hanratty, who is chasing Frank down, and Christopher Walken is also in it as Frank's dad. As we're going to go into so much depth about this story, you're going to need a scuba certification. Now's the time to say that, of course, there will be spoilers throughout. This entire episode is one giant spoiler about Frank Abagnale Jr. In fact, if you've seen the film Catch Me If You Can, well, caveated at the beginning by saying it's inspired by a true story, it confirms it was based on the book by Frank Abagnale with Stan Redding. In the opening credits, this book has been published as Catch Me If You Can, the true story of a real fake. And it can be found in the biography, autobiography, memoir, and true crime categories the internet over. So we can all be forgiven if we take it as read that the movie probably does contain some events that actually happened, and it does, kind of. What most people don't seem to know, myself included, until about a year ago, is that the story behind this story is one giant lie. Hold on to your comb-overs. Is it a surprise that the con man conned further? Didn't he? The version we all know, if you've ever heard of Frank Abagnale Jr., it's most likely connected either in connection to the book or the film. He's been on numerous TV chat shows talking about escapades, and later in life, he made a career by becoming a consultant expert on identity scams, cybercrimes, check frauds, etc. He hit the conference circuit hard as a guest speaker and now earns thousands and thousands of dollars per engagement. There was even a Broadway musical based on the film that came out in 2011, which I actually never heard of it, and it won a Tony Award. Probably because I don't like musicals. At the time of this episode, Abagnale is 76 and living a pretty cushy life. And what a life this man has had. Here's a summary in his own words from a speech he gave in 1994. When I was 16 years old, I successfully impersonated an airline pilot for Pan American Airlines for 2 years until I was 18. At the age of 18, I became the chief resident pediatrician of a Georgia hospital where I practiced medicine for about a year. At the age of 19, having never been to law school in my life, I took the state bar exam in the state of Louisiana. Passed the bar, became a licensed attorney. Before my 19th birthday was over, I was appointed the Assistant Attorney General of the state, where I practiced law in that position for about a year. At the age of 20, I was a college professor at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. I taught 2 full semesters there as a PhD, of course. If I was old enough to drink, I was a millionaire twice over. Pretty impressive cons going on here. Let's keep an eye on the timeline too, as we'll be revisiting it again later. So he impersonated a pilot at 16, doctor at 18, lawyer at 19, college professor at 20, and if you've seen the film, you might remember an extremely suave DiCaprio in a fake pilot's uniform escorting air hostesses around and getting free flights all over the country. In his doctor guise, he was extremely suave in his white coat, asking medical students their opinion instead of offering his own and asking the others if they concurred. Yeah, he saw that on that TV show, didn't he? In the film, he started at a new school and was bumped by a stereotypical jock in the hallway, so he took his revenge and pretended to be a substitute French teacher. Oh, and when he saw he was in the same class as said jock, he looked and acted older than his years. Because he had that smooth, unflappable confidence, he pushed his luck, and people just believed him. People do generally just believe, though. Even if you're looking out for con people, you're like, of course he's the real guy. Of course he's a teacher. Why would I question him? Because if you question him, and he turns out to be the teacher, then it's not going to end well for you. Here's some more background on his life and exploits. He was very close with his dad, Frank Abagnale Sr., growing up. but his mother, Paulette, doesn't get much of a mention in the movie. She's portrayed as the destroyer of the Abagnale family unit when she and Frank Sr. get divorced due to her having an affair. According to Frank Jr.'s real life, he says that he went to a courthouse in New York to hear his parents were splitting up, and he'd have to choose who to live with. Instead of doing that, he ran out in a mad panic and scraped by on the streets until managing to steal or start his fake pilot scam. He never saw his father again. But in the movie, Frank Sr. pops up quite a lot. I guess it would have been a waste of Christopher Walken otherwise. So cut up was he by his parents' divorce that Abagnale says he cried himself to sleep every night till he was 19. Abagnale has admitted many times to writing bad checks, mostly defrauding Pan American Airlines. This means that he was using fake paper checks to cash payments from Pan Am as though they were his salary. He didn't work for Pan Am, for the record. He just had a pilot's uniform, and he said he worked for them. This was in the 60s, so it was a lot easier to forge checks than it is nowadays, although they are still a very insecure form of payment. Yeah, I'm always amazed, like Americans, apparently us, we use checks. I haven't had a checkbook since I was a teenager, because it's a very insecure form of payment. And also insane, Abagnale has stated that he wrote 17,000 bad checks over the span of his criminal escapades, which was only in the space of a few years, and that at the time, this totaled around 2.5 million, the equivalent of about 20 million today. Eventually, his life of crime caught up with him, and the FBI, who had been unsuccessfully chasing him for years, finally got their man. Although not before Frank's daring escape from an airplane toilet. You hear this part, and it can't be true. Like the bit in the movie where he goes into the toilet and he pulls the toilet up and manages to slide down and get to I think it's a landing gear. I saw this movie as a kid, and then every time I go into an airplane toilet, I'm like, there's no freaking way. You'd lift up that toilet and it would just be like a steel wall or whatever and a tiny little pipe hole. There's no magical exit through a toilet. That was the movie version anyway, which was based on the book. But Frank has walked back that in more recent times and confirmed that he actually escaped from the galley, not the toilet. Which makes a lot more sense, but not total sense. And I guess the galley has that, they bring stuff up from down below in the galley, right? On big planes. And there's a lift, I'm imagining. Or have I just seen that in movies rather than real life? But I feel like there's probably more exit points from the galley than there are from that tiny toilet. When the FBI did catch him, he spent a few years in prison before being recruited by them, first for some undercover missions, then as a lecturer, then in some other nebulous capacity that might carry on to this day. As well as pulling off these successful cons, Frank really made it as somebody in the world of crime. He was the youngest person to make it on the FBI's most wanted list. He turned down 3 presidential pardons. He was given the title of Master Thief by Interpol when he told his story in the early 80s, which had only ever been given to 108 people since 1902. And he was the youngest recipient. It's not really a thing. I don't think Interpol would really have something called Master Thief. Makes it sound like an achievement. We rooted for Leo in the film because he wasn't hurting anyone. He was scamming money from the big boys who wouldn't even really notice it was gone. He was staying one step ahead of the law and having fun along the way. So who could really begrudge him his freedom and a happy ending? The real Frank Abagnale has stated that about 80% of the movie is true, and has also said on the record numerous times that he didn't steal from individuals and that any money he took dishonestly, he has since paid back. Ooh, what a hero. The kind of cheeky, chappy, sticking it to the man story that we can all get behind and cheer him on for this quick thinking genius and ball of steel. I get the feeling that he actually hurt people and stole from the little man, but allegedly. Let's find out. The slightly changing versions. Frank Abagnale has been at this a long time, decades of telling rooms packed full of people about his audacious scams. This includes even friends that I know who saw him give a keynote speech, I think a couple of years ago, or I can't remember exactly how long. But they don't remember much about seeing Abagnale, but he did confirm that he used the speech to talk about his former life of crime, and he was a very interesting and engaging speaker. His story first came to public attention in 1977 when he was on a game show called To Tell the Truth. And this is how the movie starts too, by the way. The idea of the show is that 3 people line up in front of a panel. The host reads out some crazy but true story about one of them, and the panel guests have to ask questions to work out which one of the 3 the story is about. The so-called main character has to answer any questions truthfully, but the other 2 can say whatever they want. And this is Frank's origin story that he submitted to the show and proclaimed that it was accurate, in which the host read aloud, quote, I, Frank William Abagnale, am known as the world's greatest imposter, and no wonder. In the course of my nefarious career, I've palmed myself off as a doctor, lawyer, college instructor, stockbroker, and airline pilot. To become an airline pilot, I merely bought a plastic ID card for $5. I fixed an airline logo from a model plane hobby kit, and in no time at all was a co-pilot for a major airline. As a bogus lawyer, I actually worked on a state attorney general's staff for 6 years. I also cashed over $2.5 million in bad checks in 26 countries. Ultimately, I was sentenced to 72 years in prison. I served 1 year in France, 1 year in Sweden. I then served 4 years in a federal prison in this country. Paroled, I now devote my life to the prevention and detection of crime. Signed, Frank William Abagnale. This differs slightly from the 6 years as an assistant to some state attorney. Didn't he say he was the assistant state attorney, but he was really an assistant to the state attorney? Different. As you may remember, this differs slightly from the intro we gave earlier on. He said he only practiced law for a year in that one, not 6 as he says in this version. His timeline definitely shortens as his star rises, packing all his impostoring into years between the ages of 16 and 21. But hey, maybe embellished a tad for television. Who wouldn't? I also heard multiple instances of him saying he was only arrested once in France. So how come he also did time in Sweden and the US? Well, he doesn't have to be arrested. He can have been arrested in France and they extradite him back to Sweden and he does a year there and extradite him back to the US, doing time there. Maybe there's no official arrest each time. I don't know. That's just being pedantic. Doesn't really matter. Can't we just let this lie as a good story? Why do we have to ruin everything by actually investigating? Well, that's kind of what this channel does, isn't it? We just ruin the fun. Well, then, now that we've heard what he has had to tell us over the years, do you want to hear the actual story of Frank Abagnale? Well, here's a hint. He's a lying liar who lies about everything. Everything we're going to cover has either been personally stated by Frank Abagnale Jr., whether in print or in interviews or talks, or it has been independently verified by at least 2 researchers. Okay, that's a good legal disclaimer there. One of these is Ellen C. Logan, who wrote a book about this story called The Greatest Hoax on Earth in 2020. The other, Javier Leyva, produced a multi-part series about Abagnale called The Real Catch Me If You Can on his podcast show, Pretend, between 2022 and 2023. All right, let's rewind back to the beginning. If we have any idea of Abagnale in our heads, it's probably the fictionalized DiCaprio version, as that film was a huge success. It also portrayed him as an only child, but in fact, Abagnale had 2 brothers and a sister. His mother also looked after at least one of his brother's children at some point. You know what? Let's rewind even further than that. Abagnale comes from Bronxville, New York, which I had actually never heard of, but apparently it's a very affluent area. According to CNBC in 2016, Bronxville was, quote, the most expensive suburb of any of the U.S.'s top 10 largest cities, the median home value of $2.3 million. What a nice upbringing he must have had in an area that these names from the notable people section of Wikipedia also call home. TV and radio star Dick Clark, New Yorker veteran journalist Brendan Gill, 5 Kennedys including John F. and Robert F., etc., etc. That is some privilege right there. Abagnale himself is the first person on the list as it's alphabetical. However, in researching for his book, The Greatest Hoax on Earth, Ellen Logan discovered that far from having been born in Bronxville, New York, Abagnale was in fact born in the Bronx, New York, a much different prospect in the late 40s. While this may seem like a minor fudge to get ahead in your career, and the family did move to Bronxville after he was born, it's just one more slippery rung on the greased ladder that is the story of Frank Abagnale Jr. I'll let that one go. I don't think that's a big deal to be like, yeah, I was born at Bronxville. It's fancy there. My family are fancy. People who are discriminating based on where you were born, like whether to give you a job or not. Oh, you're from Bronxville, huh? My family's also from Bronxville. La-di-da. And then they're giving you a job because of that. Those people deserve it. If you just say that you're from there, even though you're not. Abagnale raised his father up as a very special person, whom he said he had the privilege of calling daddy, which was always very heartwarming to hear, although just a tad cringy with the modern-day connotations of the word. This does then beg the question, if you were so close, why did you run away at the age of 16 and never see him again? Well, he did see him again, but we'll come to that later. Far from being an adulteress who ruined their family, Paulette Abagnale was a put-upon wife trying to look after several children. She actually did not have an affair. As for her portrayal in the film and musical, and while she did remarry, it wasn't until nearly 20 years after the divorce. Like, if I was that person, I would not be happy about being portrayed like that in a very famous movie. And it's going to be very famous because it's got DiCaprio and Tom Hanks in it, Christopher Walken. Frank Sr., not quite the hero dad. Frank Sr., on the other hand, wasn't exactly the paragon of paternal values that Frank Jr. would have us believe. He got remarried a mere 3 months after the divorce. It seems that the party who was really the catalyst for the end of the marriage had been misidentified. Indeed, according to Frank's older brother Roy had to leave the Marines early to support his mother and siblings due to his father's alcoholism, repeated violations of a court order, which were supposed to keep him away from Paulette, the fact that he was providing no parental or financial support, so he was just a deadbeat dad. Well, they portray him so nicely in the film, and he had a restraining order or something against him? Why did Frank like him so much? We do have to find a little grain of salt to take this information with. And we'll come back to Roy Abagnale later on, and this story just keeps on giving. Indeed, it does. Paulette Abagnale was so upset over her portrayal in the film, of course she would be, that her niece told the Pretend podcast that she had actually sued DreamWorks Studios over it, which I don't blame her. I'd probably do the same thing, assuming a lawyer told me that it was chill. They reached an out-of-court settlement, so this information can't be verified as it's not public. But the host was pretty sure this was true. I mean, it sounds completely legit. While we're on the subject of the end of the Abagnale's marriage, let's revisit the court proceedings. Young Frank, all fresh-faced and earnest-looking, gets summoned to a courthouse, only to have it dropped on him that his beloved parents are splitting up and he'd have to choose who to live with. Does this sound likely? I mean, he's 16 at this point. Don't you think that his folks might have mentioned it to him earlier, rather than waiting to punk him with a potentially life-changing choice on the actual divorce day? Yeah, it seems insane and unbelievable. Also, would you even ask a 16-year-old? Sure, it would be part of the decision-making process, but I feel like if I was a judge on that case, I'd be like, well, your father has a restraining order against him, he's an alcoholic, he doesn't contribute any money, so no. You're not going to live with him, even though you want to. You're not, because you're 16, you're a minor, I make the decisions, I'm a judge, that's final. It was this event that started his no-good life of crime, as he was so upset he just ran away and then apparently cried every night for 3 years over it. I don't want to sound unsympathetic here, as my parents are still happily married, so I don't really know the trauma that comes with a divorce, but I mean, crying every night for 3 years? Maybe if he was younger, but from 16 to 19, I mean, come on. Yeah, I don't know. Some pretty traumatic things happen. I don't think I've ever cried myself to sleep for 3 years. Excuse me. We come upon our next wrinkle in Abagnale's supposed story. According to Javier, who I believe 100%, there was no divorce hearing in a courtroom in New York. The divorce was actually finalized in Mexico, which, during the divorce boom of the 60s, was not uncommon. The couple involved didn't even have to be there. You could just have a representative on your behalf, and hey, presto, your marriage was dissolved. No dramatic exits onto the street required. So we're getting to the start of Frank Jr.'s exploits now, as he starts his amazing life of crime by pretending to be a pilot at the age of 16. And here's one thing that is true about Abagnale. He did look older than he was, and while he was no DiCaprio, at least DiCaprio from 20 years ago, he wasn't a bad-looking fellow. He managed to get his hands on a pilot uniform, which he says he got fitted for by showing a fake Pan Am ID card, but could also just have been a costume one. He managed to find his way on the free flights across the states and eventually the world. He flew over 1 million miles for nothing. He visited 26 countries. This at the age of 16, remember? So around 1964, he started creating and altering checks from Pan Am to fund his new lifestyle as a pilot on the move, and recruited groups of attractive women to dress as flight attendants and accompany him on trips to wherever. I mean, it's a great story, but it just seems so unlikely when you think about it. Some of this is true, as Abagnale did indeed pretend to be a pilot, but it was not at the age of 16. What was he actually doing at the age of 16? Well, we'll get to that. What's next? Ah, yes, doctor. Yes, he pretended to be a doctor when he was around 18. Abagnale would have us believe that he moved into some fancy new digs in the state of Georgia and had to put his occupation on the application form. He put that he was a doctor so that it fit in with his new neighbors, and this somehow escalated him to actually doing rounds in Cobb County General Hospital for a year, where he became the chief resident pediatrician. Don't worry though, he didn't actually perform any surgeries or procedures himself. He managed to spend the whole time in a sort of supervisory role, which must have been a relief as he had practically zero medical training. I feel like this is the sort of thing that if someone dies, dude, because you were the medical student cutting someone open and they're like, should I make the incision here? Do you concur? He's like, yes. And then they just bleed out. You go to prison for a long, long time. Well, it's funny to watch in a film. It's very just scary to think that a teenager could just pretend to be a doctor for a year and no one would notice. Actually, I do know this has happened fairly recently when I think it was an 18-year-old, like Malachi Robertson or something, called himself Dr. Love, managed to open a medical center in 2016. It was in Florida, so it's not surprising. Just kidding. But he was caught defrauding patients and sent to jail. While he thankfully wasn't doing much hands-on medical stuff, there is something he was actually doing at the age of 18 that precludes Abagnale from having pretended to be a doctor for a year. But we'll come to that. After that stint, he then allegedly moved to New Orleans, where he faked his way through the Louisiana State bar exam and then secured a job in the Attorney General's office. He says that he worked there for almost a year before they figured out that he wasn't really a lawyer and let him go quietly so as not to embarrass themselves. Sounds super legit, right? Don't worry though, he's since admitted that he actually failed the bar exam twice before passing it on his third attempt, which makes it much more believable. And actually kind of impressive considering how smart you have to be to pass the bar, let alone without any formal training, so he says. But it isn't true. What about that time he was a college professor? Well, he said he faked his way into teaching a semester or two, depending on where he's telling the story, of sociology at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. He claimed that he had a forged PhD and everything, and that no one at the school noticed for months. This is also, of course, not true. And now we come to what Frank Abagnale Jr. was actually doing with his time during the years when he claims he was flying around the world impersonating doctors and lawyers and pilots. Here's the reality. He was in prison. He was in prison for a lot of that time. Alan C. Logan got access to Frank Abagnale's full FBI file obtained via Freedom of Information requests, and this alone is 1,000 pages long. That's how many lies this man has told. He also went through a little mountain of other documentation and, with the help of private investigators, was able to track Abagnale's movements in minute detail from 1965 to 1974. Here's how it really went down. In 1965, at the age of 17, Frank Abagnale Jr. did actually run away from home. That part's true. He stole a few $100s from his dad by using a gas credit card and forging his signature, and then got arrested that same year. No global cons, no Pan Am pilot gig, just petty theft and a local arrest. Between 1965 and 1969, Frank Abagnale was in and out of prison for various crimes, mostly involving fraud and stolen checks. He used a ton of fake names and identities during this time. Not glamorous ones, just basic ones like Robert Conrad, Frank Williams, John O'Reilly. This is also why so much of his criminal history didn't show up when journalists tried to fact-check his story years later. He had dozens of aliases, so you had to know which name to search. In 1969, he was arrested in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for stealing checks and committing bank fraud. So, not flying around the world, not becoming a lawyer, not doing surgery, just a regular con man sitting in jail. He served time at Federal Correctional Institution in Petersburg, Virginia. So what about the stuff he claimed happened during this time, like becoming a doctor or a lawyer? All impossible. He was in prison. But what about the Pan Am pilot scam? Okay, yes, this one is the most plausible part of the story. There is evidence that he did pose as a pilot for Pan Am and used it to scam hotels, car rentals, and possibly get a few free rides in airline jump seats. But it wasn't to the extent that he described, and he certainly wasn't flying to 26 countries or logging over 1 million miles. Logan found that Abagnale did have a fake pilot's uniform, and he used it mostly to impress people and check into hotels without paying up front. He also forged Pan Am paychecks and deposited them into banks under different names. He got caught and arrested, but not before doing some damage to hotels and banks around the U.S. So while it's true that he did pretend to be a pilot, it wasn't the grand international venture he sold in his book or on screen. Now, let's talk about the victims, because this wasn't all cheeky fun and clever tricks. People were hurt. Frank Abagnale didn't just scam big corporations. He left individual hotel owners and small businesses out of pocket. There were secretaries and clerks who lost their jobs for cashing his checks. At one point, he even convinced a 19-year-old woman to help him pass fake checks. She ended up getting arrested and serving jail time for it. These are real consequences. It's not the victimless crime the movie makes it out to be. You can see why he lie about this though, right? Because the movie makes him look like a clever, mischievous genius. But the truth, he was just a grifter who got caught a lot and caused real harm along the way. So what happened after prison? Frank Abagnale was released from federal custody in 1974 after serving about 5 years of a 10-year sentence. This was due to a parole deal that was contingent on his supposed willingness to help the federal government investigate fraud. And here begins Act 2 of the myth. Once released, Abagnale realized something important. While he wasn't very good at not getting caught, he was very good at telling stories. So he pivoted. Instead of trying to scam banks, he decided to sell the story of how he had scammed banks. People ate it up. By the late 70s, Abagnale was giving talks to banks, law enforcement, and universities. He pitched himself as an expert in forgery, identity theft, and white-collar crime. Here's the thing. There was some value in what he had to say. He had forged checks after all. He'd used fake documents and aliases. So sure, maybe he could help institutions spot people doing the same. That said, Alan Logan and Javier found no evidence that Abagnale ever worked officially for the FBI in any meaningful capacity. Despite decades of him claiming, quote, I work for the FBI, I have an office, I teach at Quantico. Nope. Multiple official Freedom of Information Act requests showed that Abagnale was never employed by the FBI, either full-time or part-time, and never had an office or security clearance. So where did this story come from? Well, some former agents have said he gave the occasional talk, like a guest lecture. But even those have dwindled over the years. He was never a regular consultant. He just kept saying it. Because people wanted to believe it, they did. So every time he said, quote, I help the FBI catch criminals, just like the one he used to be, it just added to the legend. And people repeat stuff they've heard, even if it's not verified. If you say something with confidence, especially on stage or on TV, it gets repeated, then written down, then becomes accepted fact, especially back then. If you say stuff on The Tonight Show or a conference in the 80s, there's no internet to fact check you in real time. Then in 1980, Frank Abagnale co-wrote the book Catch Me If You Can with Stan Redding. Here's the kicker. Stan Redding never fact-checked the story. He just took Abagnale at his word and helped turn his version of events into a compelling narrative. The publisher marketed it as a true story, and it sold well, really well. So well, in fact, that it caught the attention of Hollywood. 2 decades later, we got the Spielberg-directed, DiCaprio starring film in 2002. And then the legend went global. After the movie came out, Abagnale became a superstar. He was doing interviews on 60 Minutes, The Tonight Show, Larry King, and countless conferences. He started a company called Abagnale and Associates, where he billed himself as a fraud prevention expert and got clients in banking, government, and education. He even gave a TED Talk in 2013. It's easier now to commit fraud than ever before. And I bet he knows that people were willing to overlook the details because the big picture sounded so good. Former con artist turned FBI asset now helps protect people from scams. It's got everything: redemption, intrigue, and entertainment. Yeah, it's like the Catch Me If You Can version of the Wolf of Wall Street guy. What's his name? Jordan Belfort, whatever. Just another dude who scammed people, made money off the scam, and now makes even more money talking about the scam. Rinse and repeat. By the 2000s and 2010s, Abagnale was charging $20,000 to $40,000 per speaking gig, appearing at banking events, security conferences, universities, and even FBI trainings. Many of these groups had no idea his story was mostly fiction. Some organizations have since quietly distanced themselves from him, but not all. He's still invited to speak even today. His website says that he's worked with more than 14,000 financial institutions, corporations, and government agencies over the past 40 plus years. That's a staggering number. But it's also like when people say, I've had 800 clients, and you're like, how many of them were one-off jobs or paid 20? It's easy to inflate numbers, even now after the publication of Alan Logan's book and the Pretend podcast series. Abagnale has not issued any retraction or apology. He still gives interviews where he dodges questions about the accuracy of his past. and leans into the same old narrative. Because at this point, why stop? It's clearly still working. People were willing to overlook the details for a long time, but eventually the truth started to catch up with Frank. As early as 1978, just a year after he appeared on the game show, a reporter named Irving Levine, working for NBC News, published a piece that questioned parts of Abagnale's story. He had tried to verify some of Frank's claims and couldn't find any evidence to support them. But no one really paid attention at the time. His story was just too good. Which happens, right? You put out the truth, and if it's not sexy, people ignore it. But if you've got a great lie, people eat that up. Then, in the 2000s, as the movie gained traction, a few more journalists raised concerns. But again, the momentum of the Hollywood machine made it hard to stop. It wasn't until Alan C. Logan started digging seriously in the late 2010s that the myth began to fall apart in public. Alan C. Logan's deep dive, Logan's book, The Greatest Hoax on Earth, was published in 2020, and it's meticulously sourced. He filed dozens of Freedom of Information Act requests, interviewed people who knew Abagnale back in the day, spoke with victims of his crimes, cross-referenced everything with court records, newspaper archives, and law enforcement files. His conclusion, quote, "Almost everything Frank Abagnale has ever said about himself is a lie." That's a big statement, but Logan backed it up. So how did the Catch Me If You Can movie get made if the story was so flimsy? Well, keep in mind that the screenplay was based on the book, and the book was ghostwritten by Stan Redding, who did not fact-check anything that Frank told him. And remember, the film opens with a disclaimer, inspired by a true story, which is Hollywood speak for, we took some names and some rough outlines and made up a bunch of cool stuff. Spielberg even said that the movie wasn't meant to be a documentary or a biography, it was meant to be entertainment. But it's still troubling that the myth has so thoroughly replaced the truth, even in schools, lectures, and FBI training events. It's one thing to fictionalize a story for the big screen, it's another to let that fiction become accepted history. And I think that's where the most of the damage is done. Not in the movie, but in Frank's own efforts to push the same narrative outside of the movie. Like you could say that movie was great fiction, and I'd be like, cool. But when Frank is out here saying that's what really happened and he's getting paid for it, that's the issue. So what can we learn from the rise and continued success of Frank Abagnale Jr.? Well, here's one. If you lie big enough and long enough and make it entertaining enough, people will believe you, and they'll pay you for it. He didn't just fool a few banks in the 60s. He fooled generations of audiences, law enforcement, journalists, educators, and business professionals. And even now, after being thoroughly debunked, he's still on the circuit, still making money, still has a website, still giving talks, and yeah, he's not hurting people in the same way anymore. But the fact that he continues to lie, that he refuses to own up to the truth, that's the part that keeps this story from being a feel-good redemption tale. The really galling part, if he had come clean, people probably would have forgiven him. I would have. If he came out in 2002 and said, hey, most of that movie, great entertainment, not real life, but I did pull a few cons and I learned from it, and here's what you should watch out for, then people would have still loved him. That would have been compelling and honest, but now it's just dishonest all the way down. Even now, people reference Abagnale Jr. as though his story were gospel. He's been cited in textbooks, training manuals, corporate handbooks, you name it. There's a whole generation who saw Catch Me If You Can and thought, wow, this guy's a genius. And in a way, maybe he is, but not in the way you think. He didn't outsmart the FBI. He didn't master multiple professions. He didn't travel the world. He didn't escape from airplanes or pass the bar at 19. He just lied really well, and he never stopped. That's not clever, that's just persistent. And it's not like the truth was hard to find. The FBI had it, the courts had it, his own victims had it, but no one wanted to look too closely because the story was too good. You know what it reminds me of? That phrase, never let the truth get in the way of a good story? Frank Abagnale Jr. lived by that rule. And everyone else just kind of played along. If you ever wonder how scams happen or why people fall for them, it's often not about intelligence, it's about emotion. Frank Abagnale made people feel something. He made them feel curious, impressed, inspired. He gave them a story they wanted to believe. And once you wanted to believe something, it's really hard to be convinced otherwise, even in the face of hard evidence. We all like to think we're skeptical, that we'd be the one to spot the lie. But the truth is, we probably wouldn't. Because when someone is confident, charming, and consistent with their lies, They're really hard to expose, especially if they're not asking you for money. All they want is your attention or your praise or your platform. You think, what's the harm? Well, the harm is in what happens next. When that person is lifted up as a role model, when they get rich and famous for telling lies, when they're treated like an expert, when they're invited to teach others, that's when the consequences spread far beyond the initial fraud. And that's what happened here. Frank Abagnale Jr. is not a folk hero. He's not a genius. He's not even that good at crime. He's just someone who lied, got caught, then lied again. Only this time he made the lies sound inspirational. And people wanted so badly for that story to be true that they never bothered to check. Until now. So next time you hear a story that seems just a little too perfect, maybe take a second look. Because behind every master con artist, there might just be another con. Yeah, this guy is a complete fraud. Not a cheeky, lovable way, just a full-on, selfish, dishonest grifter who's made millions off a lie and continues to. It's such a shame. Because it could have been a good story about redemption, but instead, it's just another scam. Well, that's it for today. Thank you for joining me. As always, if you like the show, leave a review, give us a thumbs up, tell a friend. We'll be back soon with another episode of the Dead Reckoning show or podcast. Till then, stay curious. And of course, if you want to support the channel, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Larry M. Lease. And thank you to our sponsor, Fastest VPN. As always, thank you so much for watching and listening. We'll see you next time.